Between 1918 and 1929, we see a period of economic developments that are shaped by the crisis of the First World War, but also the recovery in the post-war era. This lesson specifically is going to talk about these economic developments in more detail. Now, we have focused on some of these aspects already because they are not only economic developments, but they are also political developments. But we will speak in more detail about the impact of the First World War, the post-war economic problems and policies as it relates to things like reparations payments in the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation, the Dawes and Young plans, as well as foreign loans, and then finish by thinking about industrial growth and agricultural development. So World War I, of course, just like it devastated pretty much every economy, devastated the German economy as well, and it led to long-lasting consequences. The first issue was the fact that we have war-related damage. The war would drain the resources and disrupt the trade within Germany, leaving Germany severely weakened when it comes to their agricultural and industrial base. In addition to this, we see that to finance the war, Germany would begin to borrow heavily, and this caused them to rely on domestic and foreign loans rather than through the raising of taxes. By the end of the war, this national debt had ballooned, and government faced a severe budget deficit. Furthermore, we have the fact that the Allied naval blockade of Germany severely restricted imports, leading to shortages of food and raw materials. And so when we get towards the end of the First World War in 1918, starvation and malnutrition were widespread, especially within the cities and in the urban environments. And so with all that in mind, the First World War was devastating in terms of the economy, but what came afterwards was the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles did a number of things. First of all, the Treaty of Versailles would strip Germany of around 13% of its overall territory. This included key areas of industrialization, so Alsace-Lorraine, for example, and the Saar Basin. These losses reduced Germany's access to coal and iron, which were both essential for industrial production and industrialization. Moreover, the demobilization of millions of soldiers and the restriction of the German military to just 100,000 soldiers led to an overwhelming labour market. Factories that had focused on war production as well had to struggle to maintain the transition back to a peacetime output, all of which resulted in widespread unemployment. The immediate post-war years then were marked by economic instability, and the government struggled to address all of these different pressures and these deficits and these reparations. We see that during and after the war, the government printed more money to try and cover expenses. This expansion of money led to a rising in inflation and the eroding of the value of the German mark. We've mentioned in previous lessons that hyperinflation would eventually start to take shape. We'll get to that in a sec. But ultimately, this was a problem that wasn't just caused by reparations. It was exacerbated by reparations, but it was caused by German macroeconomic practices prior to the end of the First World War. Government's inability to balance the budget also exacerbated inflation, as you can imagine. But it was in 1921 when the Allied Reparations Commission set the German reparations payments, and it was agreed, like I mentioned, in 1919 at the Treaty of Versailles that Germany would take the blame for the war guilt clause. And so as a result of taking the blame for the war, they would have to pay reparations. And as I mentioned in previous lessons, by 1921, this number was eventually set. And Allied Reparations Commission set the number to be 132 billion gold marks. Now, this represented about £6.6 billion at the time, or $33 billion at the time, a significant amount of money that was required. These payments placed an enormous strain on the German economy and fueled further resentment among the population. The treaty also restricted Germany's ability to rebuild its economy by imposing limits on its military and foreign trade. So there was no air force that was allowed, there was no tanks that was allowed, there was no submarines that was allowed. They were allowed to have, I think, a maximum of 7 battleships as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. All of this hindered the construction and the industrialization policies that can have a good economic effect on the economy of a country, but it further hindered their ability to pay reparations. All of this leads to the hyperinflation crisis. Now, this is a particularly blurry image, which I apologize for, but there aren't many good images of hyperinflation in 1923, but it's an image of children playing with I believe, money. They're playing with piles and piles and piles of cash. And that's because of how worthless it became. It became one of the most significant economic crises in the post-war era, and it peaks in 1923. And it was caused by a number of things, okay? So we know already that it was caused by the policy of passive resistance. So in 1923, as the result of Germany's failure to keep up with reparations payments, the French and the Belgians decided that they were going to invade and occupy the industrial base of the German state, which was the Ruhr Valley. So they occupied it in 1923, and the Germans, of course, being significantly weakened and having no military, was not going to respond by using excessive force, but instead it responded by encouraging a policy of passive resistance. Passive resistance was essentially a policy of going on strike while the government would continue to pay their wages so they could afford to go on strike. This had a major problem. Not only was the industrial output of the German state significantly weakened by the fact that no one was working in it, but then they had to pay the wages of everybody who was now on strike, all of which contributed to a further financial strain. In addition to this, the printing of money was the option that the Reichsbank decided to go for when it came to both paying to finance the strike and to government expenses and to reparations payment. So they printed more and more money, further devaluing the currency. This leads to a point in 1923, in November 1923, when the German marks becomes worthless. The exchange rate, for reference, reached up to 4.2 trillion German marks to the $1. That basically means that if I went to Germany in November 1923 and I had $1, I could go to the bank and I could exchange my one single $1 for 4.2 trillion German marks. Hence why you have people with barrels and barrels of cash. There was no cards, there was no banking system in that kind of way, like online banking or anything. It was done with money. And so you can see just how worthless that was. And so if, for example, I wanted to buy a loaf of bread and a loaf of bread cost the equivalent of $2 in Germany, I'd have to go to the shop with a big barrel of 8.4 trillion German marks in order to be able to pay for it. Now, the result of doing this, by the way, is that basically the central bank of a country will start to print higher and higher value currencies. So instead of having 4.2 trillion marks as represented in sort of like 5 mark notes, for example, which of course would be ludicrous, they would start to print the 100 mark note or the 1,000 mark note, just like how we have £20 notes and £20 notes and £10 notes and £50 notes, and eventually they will start to print the billion mark note and the trillion mark note, and all of this becomes particularly impactful, especially on the middle class. Because if you have a bank account, let's say, and in that bank account you have 50,000 marks, okay? Prior to November 1923, that was a lot of money. That could get you a lot of things. That could maybe buy you a house, or that could even buy whatever, okay? You had plenty of savings. But after November 1923, 50,000 marks was completely worthless, because I could have just walked in with one single $1 and I would get 4.2 trillion marks, which meant that if I had 50,000 marks in my bank account and I wanted to withdraw these marks from my bank account, And in order to, and if I was to do that, it would lead to a situation where I then went to go and trade that for in US currency. I would get basically nothing back. So you can see how this obviously wipes out these people's savings, these pensions, and all these different kinds of things. But you could also see how this could lead to a situation where people who are in debt are able to pay that debt very quickly. By contrast, let's say I was in debt with 50,000 marks. Okay, I had 50,000 marks of debts on my name. Well, in 1922 or 1921 or whatever, this was probably a lot of money. This was a considerable amount of money, and so I was in debt to that. But then by November 1923, 50,000 marks was basically nothing. I could just go in with $1 and I could pay that off, and I would still have 4.2 trillion marks left. So that is there's a sort of winners and losers in the hyperinflation crisis. But on the whole, hyperinflation is a bad thing. It is a disastrous outcome. And so the resolution of the hyperinflation crisis is, of course, the introduction of the Rentenmark in 1923 under the leadership of Gustav Stresemann. Now, in addition to this, we see the ways in which the German state begins to stabilize the economy by trying to deal with the reparations crisis. So there were two main plans that were introduced during this period. You had first the Dawes Plan of 1924, and what the Dawes Plan did, which was introduced by a US economist or a US banker, I believe, by the name of Charles Dawes, it introduced it reduced the annual reparations payments, and it tied those reparations payments to Germany's economic performance, making them more manageable. What this means is essentially, whereas prior to this, the Allies essentially said, I don't care whether or not your economy is doing well or not doing well, you have 132 billion gold marks that you have to pay, and that's divided over a period of time. So every single year we expect this much money to come to us, regardless of how well or bad your economy is doing. Under the Dawes Plan, it tied them to economic performance. So if Germany's economy was doing better, they would pay more reparations that year, and if their economy was doing bad, they would pay less reparations that year. So it would represent a stable percentage of the economy rather than being a fixed number. The plan also facilitated substantial loans from American banks. This amounted to 800 million marks initially, and these funds helped to stabilize the economy and also to finance reconstruction. We also get the 1929 Young Plan. I believe in the previous lesson I said 1928. It's 1929 when the Young Plan was introduced. And this reduced the total reparations burden to 112 billion marks, and it extended the time period in which Germany was able to repay them. These would now be payable over 59 years. It removed foreign controls over German finances and restored some economic sovereignty. So the Young Plan was probably the best you were going to get in 1929, and it made the reparations payments far, far, far more manageable. Now, it did face opposition from right-wing nationalists, including people like Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler used it to fuel anti-Weimar propaganda. He believed, for example, that the November criminals and as cited by Hitler, the Jews who stabbed Germany in the back in November of 1918 were to blame for all of these ills and all of these wrongs, and the Treaty of Versailles was a surrender to the French and to the British and to the Americans, all of which he would have not done if he had been in power. I would have wondered how that would have went for him, but ultimately this was some of the kind of nationalist rhetoric that leads him to be able to gain significant authority and control in the future. So ultimately then, these foreign loans and the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan underpinned much of Germany's recovery during the Golden Age. They funded infrastructure projects, they were able to help modernize the industries, they also supported public spending. And now Germany's reliance on foreign capital meant it was dependent on those loans, but that made it vulnerable to external economic shocks, and economic shocks such as the Great Depression was a weakness that became evident during this particular period. In terms of industrial and agricultural developments, then, let's just finish with these. Despite early crises, the industrial sector would significantly grow and recover during the mid 1920s. So we see a modernization and an expansion of industrialization. Investments in technology and infrastructure that were funded by foreign loans under the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan modernized the industrial base. So we see that the pre-war levels of industrialization were surpassed by 1928, and some of examples of the kind of industries that we see are industries such as that of coal, steel, and chemicals that drove German recovery. Companies like IG Farben and Krupp became global leaders in the fields of industrial expansion. The improved production capabilities, in addition to the international agreements, also allowed Germany to export further to global markets. This regained competitiveness within global markets and global areas. Now, despite this being the case, it was still nevertheless concluded that small businesses would often struggle, while the large firms, the IG Farbens and the Krupps of the German economy, would thrive. Smaller business would often struggle to compete. And there was also regional disparities as well, in the sense that there was uneven development. Industrial recovery was concentrated in areas like Berlin and the Ruhr Valley, whereas the more rural and peripheral regions within Germany would start to lag behind. We do also, however, get agricultural development, but it was a sector that would essentially face persistent difficulties during the 1920s. Essentially, the agricultural sector, compared to that of the industrial sector, contrasted sharply, because industry grew while the economy didn't. The agriculture sector didn't really. So there was a decline in agricultural prices during the period of the Weimar Constitution. This was the result of a couple of reasons. Firstly, there was a global overproduction. There was a widespread surplus of agricultural products. This led to the falling and the reducing in the prices of those products, because, of course, supply was so high and so price was so low because the demand remained relatively stable. This reduced incomes for German farmers. Moreover, many farmers had borrowed heavily during the war and the post-war periods, and the falling prices made it very difficult for these German farmers to repay any of the loans that they had essentially gotten themselves into, and it led to widespread bankruptcies of German farmers and German farms. Farmers also felt neglected by the government, which prioritized industrial recovery over agricultural concerns. It was this kind of discontent which contributed to support for right-wing movements, including the Nazi Party, when it came to rural areas. And then finally, another reason why the agricultural sector lagged behind that of the industrialization was the fact that agriculture saw limited modernization. Traditional farming practices and methods would persist, and this reduced the productivity and competitiveness of the German agricultural sector.